Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. We got a good topic for you today. Serious, let's do it. What's the scariest thing you've ever seen? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was 7. My two sisters and I were home alone in our new house that wasn't finished. No phone or nothing installed yet. Mom was in the city a few hours away and wouldn't be home until late. The house is out in the country, with a quarter-mile gravel driveway. Closest neighbors are just under 2 miles away. We were playing Uno or some shit when our dog started barking all crazy-like. My sister, who was 11 or 12, went outside and there was an old-ass creepy pale green van driving down our driveway, and they stopped halfway down, and one person got out and approached the dog. It was a nice dog and not really scary or aggressive at all, and went up to the dude and he got our dog to get in the van, and then they kept driving toward the house. So my sister came in and locked all the doors and started freaking out. After about 5 minutes of hearing our dog's muffled barks, we started hearing a bunch of banging on the doors, like people were trying to get in, so we went downstairs to let them see people were there. It was 3 dudes dressed in all black wearing ski masks. One of them was a little person. They just stopped and waved at us. They tried even harder to bust in the doors and break the windows and shit. Our windows were these thick-ass double-paned semi-plexiglass things that are apparently impossible to break. But we went upstairs and his in the attic, effing armed with a hammer and some screwdrivers, and they continued for like an hour banging on shit and screaming that they were going to get in and we should just let them so they wouldn't have to hurt us when they did. Effing terrifying. Anyway, after that hour, we heard them drive off and waited like 20 minutes. Then my sister went out and let our dog in and brought her to the attic. Like 2 hours later, someone came to the door and rang the doorbell for like 15 minutes straight, knocking and ringing the doorbell. We never checked, but I'm assuming it was the same people. Effing still periodically have nightmares about that shit, and it was 20 years ago. Camping with my husband in the North Idaho mountains. It was 9 or 10 p.m., and we just started to lay down in our small, tiny person tent for the night. Suddenly, we hear these huge, heavy, thudded footsteps on the ground coming right up to us. As it got closer, we also noticed how loud, deep, slow, and heavy its breathing was. We instantly knew this animal, a bear. We stayed absolutely still. We both did not breathe. My husband was holding a knife in his hands. There was a spear whittled just outside the tent door, but I was not about to move to grab it. We were quite literally paralyzed with fear. The bear moved to the bottom of our tent and started nudging my feet through it. I was in my sleeping bag, but at that point I was just a potato sack to this guy. He then just laid down right there, at the edge of our tent for about 10 minutes, soon wandered off afterwards through the campsite. Later that night, some deer and dogs came through, and they sounded completely different from this guy. I'll never forget that night though. 10 years ago now. 3 a.m., working security in a hospital and having to go into the mortuary because of an alarm being tripped to hear low-level moans and groans from the fridges. Turns out dead bodies expel air and gas after they're dead, but I literally shit myself in there. I've also seen shadows and motion lights being activated in an empty hallway. Not the nicest when you're alone on graveyard shift. I know you work at a hospital, so you expect some things, and you know that, corpses do expel gases out of their bodies. Knowing all that, if you hear it in a mortuary, it's acceptable to poop yourself. I climbed a mountain in Romania wearing just a t-shirt, jeans, and boots. Started off in the middle of the afternoon. Also, I was drunk. Got to the top, by which time it was pitch dark, icy, and the temperature was plummeting. Was convinced that I was going to die. When I worked night shift, I'd run in my neighborhood at night on my days off. It's not unusual to hear dogs barking, and on one particular night, I hear a dog barking. Thought nothing of it until I started hearing paws and claws on the pavement behind me. I turned around, and there was a huge pit bull mix running right at me barking. I knew I couldn't outrun him. I was at a loss on what to do. So I bent down, got a soft voice, and called him over as if he was my own. He turned into a big baby who just wanted love, and then he ran off. I was walking home alone from a night out at around 1:30 a.m. nighttime in a kind of large city. This homeless guy, or guy on drugs, took offense that I gave him a terrified look when he surprised me with his walking up on me. This guy lost it on me. I tried apologizing to him. Sorry is not going to do it. He started following me. He was upset with me. I walked faster, but he kept following me. I start jogging, he starts chasing me. I start running. He's making threats as he's chasing me. Come here, I'm gonna beat the shit out of you. I forget what exactly he said, but I do remember him screaming, I'm a homicidal maniac, in a shrill voice I'll never forget. I book it for 2 blocks to shake him off me. I never ran so hard in my life before. He managed to chase me for 1. I continued to jog home non-stop. After 2 hours, I collect myself enough to make a police report. Never felt adrenaline so intensely. I'm guessing the guy was high on meth. Narrowly missing a catastrophic car accident with a drunk driver only because a stranger risked their life and prevented it. I was headed to work driving down 285 in Atlanta at 2:30 a.m. in November in the rain. At the farthest point of my visibility, I suddenly saw a pair of legs that were more black than the night, running into my path from the side of the road. I thought someone was trying to end things, so I slowed down as I rounded a curve to the left. A drunk guy in a black car had crashed into the concrete median, completely perpendicular to the direction of traffic. He was completely blocking the inner lane, my lane, and had his lights off and door open, just sitting there. The legs I had seen belonged to Hero Bro, who had stopped on the side of the road and run across to check on him. If I hadn't seen him, I would have rounded that corner doing 75 and most likely have killed everyone involved. I stopped just before I got to them, spoke briefly to our savior, and offered to wait and keep my headlights and flashers on until the cops got there. Every time another person flew around the curve behind me, I braced for impact. The longer I sat there, the more it sank in that in another timeline, I was already dead or bleeding out. 7 or 8 minutes later, a cruiser arrived and I beat it. I was so rattled. I never got my hero's name and can't even remember if I said thank you. But seeing him running across the highway, black on black, replays in my mind. If he had hesitated for 3 seconds, I wouldn't be here. War. It's not the way Hollywood glamorizes it. More scared than you have ever been in your life, watching brothers bleed out and scream for their moms, assuming they aren't in little pieces, carrying a single round on your flak jacket, so if you get surrounded, you can kill yourself. Hearing the pops of distant mortar tubes and listening as they get closer, praying that they don't smoke you. When everything goes silent and the world explodes, slow motion sets in. You can't breathe, chaos everywhere. And the worst of all, effing IEDs, man. Trying to fight something you can't even see. 1 minute, it's sunny. The next, the world is black and people are screaming. Those screams will forever haunt you. My 4th miscarriage. I almost bled to death, leaving behind 3 living children and my husband. Scary and very depressing. 4 years ago, September 23rd. Then, there was getting caught in a landslide with my friend and my 2-year-old daughter on a narrow mountain road. I thought we were all going to die, that one of those boulders is going to push us off this mountain, plummeting us to our deaths or crush us. Or one of the trees that were falling into the road. So many things in a small amount of time. Hearing the branches and rocks hitting the car. Seeing trees and boulders come down into the road behind us in the rearview mirror. It sounded like thunder. We did get rescued by 2 gals in a big SUV trying to drive through, coming the other way after I tried to drive around a big rolling rock and got stuck. My friend started screaming my name over and over. I can still hear her in my head sometimes. My baby was crying for her daddy on the way back down the mountain. It was awful. I couldn't even cry until later that night. I was riding a bicycle on an empty road with long trees on both sides, and there was no wind, and it's so quiet. I didn't see anyone around, but still I felt like someone was chasing me. FYI, I watched a horror movie just the night before. I don't want to look back, but the thought of someone chasing me is raising my heartbeat to the point I could listen to it. Then I felt like if I look back and find no one, then I'll be a bit more comfortable. So I looked back and found no one. And my immediate thought was ghosts can switch places immediately. and I'm scared shit to look front now. I fell down, got hurt, left my bicycle, and ran away. After a certain distance, I realized that everything is happening in my mind, but not in reality, and I felt cheated by my thoughts. From then, whenever I get a scary thought, I tell myself you're being cheated, don't believe yourself, as a reality is far more different than your thoughts. I had a few moments like that when I was younger, though walking, not riding a bicycle, but not being able to look forward is tough on a bike, so glad you ended up okay, but sounds scary. I was homesick from work and couldn't get up without feeling like I was going to pass out. I begged my parents to take me to a doctor, but my stepfather told me it was too expensive and to just sleep it off. My boyfriend came over and saw the state I was in and took me to the hospital. Turned out I had pneumonia that had taken over half of one of my lungs. Stepdad seemed more angry that he was wrong about the fact that I could have died had I followed his advice. Well, one Saturday my sister and I were watching TV and my parents and brother were out. I decided to cycle to my friends on the green and white BMX, and when I got there, this car drove past me, pointing a pistol at me. I was 10 years old at the time. I had and hid behind my bike, and then when they passed, I cycled back home, told my sister about what was happening, and tears, and she told my parents, and later on that day, I remember my dad being so full of rage and wanting to catch who'd done this for weeks afterwards as well. When I was a young boy, my father sent me to go check on our cattle, but right as I stepped into the pasture, the bull came tearing into view and charged right at me. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was about to die, but my dog ran in between me and the bull. He jumped up and bit the bull on the nose, then ran off with the bull chasing him instead of me. This is going to be long, but it's worth the read. My grandpa had Parkinson's. My siblings, my parents, and I all lived in the same house while I was growing up, and when his disease was at its worst, he took a normal dose, a medication called levodopa. I'll call it CL from here on out, to help with the symptoms. In normal doses, it was fine, but there were times he would forget he had already taken his dose and redose again. The worst was when he would do this 3 or 4 times. He would overdose on the medicine, and he would become animalistic. My grandpa was really skinny. Side effects of the disease: he couldn't swallow food, and the insurers he was on just didn't cut it for weight gain. He had small wisps of black hair that stuck out from his head wildly. He was also very tall. I remember his arms and legs were incredibly long. He was also covered in liver spots. I'm not trying to be rude, but he looked like a tall version of Gollum. His appearance was shocking and, of course, scary to me as a child. One night, he had overdosed on the CL pretty bad while the rest of us were asleep. It had to be in the very late night or early morning hours. My bedroom was at the top of the stairs. It was mostly an attic that the staircase led directly into my room. There was no door separating the stairs from my room, and I heard creaking at the end of the stairs. I knew it was somebody coming up, so I got out of bed to look. I didn't turn the lights at first, but I was kind of shocked to not see anybody at the end of the stairs like I had expected. But I did see a round shadow sticking out of the stairwell. I turned on the lights, and it was my grandpa's head. He was staring blankly at the wall, peering around the corner of this stairwell. I remember his pupils being way too big for his eyes, which is a side effect of overdosing on CL. It fixated right on me, and it was still his neck and head peering around the corner. He hadn't moved his body completely into the stairwell at this point. His gaze was fixated on me, and I just remember freezing. I was petrified. The next thing I know, he's on all fours barreling up the stairs towards me. And it was the spider-like movement of his arms and legs that finally had me screaming. I've never seen a human body move like that. Legs twisting up almost over his shoulders, and he was moving so fast. It was the fastest I've ever seen anybody ever move while on all fours. And when taken in large doses, CL loosens up your joints and can cause extreme flexibility. He never took his gaze off me the few seconds it took him to crawl up the stairs. His head stayed perfectly still as his limbs barreled over each other. This all happened within maybe 5 to 10 seconds, and thank God for my father. He heard me screaming and managed to push me out of the way right before my grandpa crashed into him. I stopped my grandpa and back a few feet and watched my father wrestle and pin down my grandfather. Very quickly afterwards, my grandpa began living in the Little Rock, Virginia permanently. He was never a danger to us when he wasn't overdosed on CL, but he became a literal monster when he was. I unfortunately will never get past that night. I've done therapy over it a few times in my adult life, but I can never seem to shake the image of the way his body moved up those stairs. The only half-assed good thing that came from this is I've always been able to watch scary movies without flinching or being scared. I guess when you're traumatized by real life as a child, nothing on TV or movies can ever be as scary. He's been gone almost 20 years now, and I hate that he suffered from Parkinson's. All the stories ever told about him was of what a good man he was before the disease took over. I sadly lost my dad 4 years ago to Parkinson's also. He inherited from my grandpa. He was luckily never scary or violent, and he lost his battle quickly, which in hindsight is a blessing. Tornado. Some friends and I went camping after a rough breakout. Was their idea of cheering me up. At the time, I had an old Dodge truck with a topper on it that we used to both pack fishing poles, tents, sleeping bags, etc. I didn't have a tent at the time and didn't exactly want to snuggle up to a buddy, so I slept in the bed of my truck in my sleeping bag. Spent a good chunk of the night drinking and laughing, but it started to rain, so we called it an early night. If I recall correctly, it was maybe an hour later we were all woken up to heavy wind, heavy rain, and hail. Wind was bad enough that some of the tents were being ripped wide open. We didn't think too much about it. Just started rushing around to pack everything up and get the hell out of there. It was a bit like a movie though, where one bright flash of lightning lit up the entire sky, and maybe 100 yards away was the tornado. We left behind some of the other camping gear and I think some clothes and started rushing around more. My mates brought their everyday sedans with them, so they made it out okay. My heavy truck though, I went to hit the gas but didn't go anywhere. In my panic, I just kept flooring it, which of course made the situation worse until eventually my truck was pulled backwards and to the side. Gently-ish ran into a pine tree and on the driver's side and watched through the headlights as the tornado passed in front of me. Couldn't have been too close, or I imagine I would have been pulled towards it, but at the time it felt like it was right there on top of me. Realizing while seeing Bundy on trial in 1979, he was the man who killed Barbara Davis Stevens on February 12, 1975. For me, kind of a Twilight Zone, big googly-eyed shock look upon seeing the gremlin on the airplane wing moment, shouting, "That's the guy who killed a girl in the woods behind the supermarket." I took way too much acid and had a full acid-fueled psychotic break. I went through a lot of different scenarios and delusions. At one point I was convinced that every person was a figment of my mind and that I was the only person existing, that everyone I knew were just people I fabricated to stop myself from going crazy. Moreover, that every tangible thing surrounding me was also fake. At first a wave of sorrow and anguish washed over me, trying to come to terms with the fact that everyone I knew were just these imagined beings. Then I became enraged that I had been pretty tricked and tore apart myself, punched a bunch of holes through the drywall, smashed all my plates, pushed over furniture, broke the TV, etc. Material possessions no longer mattered since they were all fake. Later on, I was catatonic, laying on the floor, staring out the window, and felt like centuries were passing in seconds, and I was slowly withering away. It doesn't make much sense, but eventually I reached a point which seemed like the end of the universe, where I had experienced my death. The universe fractured and time broke, and it just kept rewinding over and over, so I was dying over and over for what I presumed would be the rest of eternity. I felt physical pain, and I would scream and puke on the floor and fall into it only to do the damage. The same thing happened again on a loop for at least an hour. Words can't really capture the flurry of heightened emotion I experienced during the whole ordeal. Even though a lot of the trip is hazy now, the terror of repeated death and the end of the known universe was something I haven't forgotten. I sort of came down and snapped it out of it when my mom got home. She took me to the hospital to be admitted into the psychiatric unit. I remember still not knowing if it was real while I was waiting in the ER. Safe to say I got sober after that and haven't touched psychedelics since.